Indeed, you got to play it fair. It sounds just like Geraldine Day. That's who she sounds like. Boy, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. Are you like me, ready to shout, "The birds are back in town"? Well, that wasn't quite a shout. I just yelled. Opening day of 2021 will be one for the history books, and that's for sure. But for very different reasons than opening day of 1954. The subject of a new article in the April issue of Baltimore Magazine by our guest tonight, Ron Casey, who writes, after 52 seasons without Big League Baseball, opening day in 1954 was one for the ages. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, the opening day is just one of many baseball images we are going to paint for your mind's eye tonight, because I know a lot of you guys out there and girls are psychic, very psychic. We've been training you psychics out there, so you didn't have to depend on anybody else but yourself, because Ron Casey has written many in-depth and fascinating articles about baseball history, and he and I have discovered we share the same taste for baseball heroes and teams such as the International League Orioles, the Light Giants, Bugle Field, and Oriole Ballpark. Ron Casey is a national award-winning senior editor at Baltimore Magazine. His work has appeared as a notable selection in the best of American sports writing, as well as in Newsweek, Huffington Post, Grist, the New York Daily News, the Baltimore Sun, Baltimore City Paper, Urbanite, where he served as editor-in-chief. Prior to becoming a full-time journalist, he spent 2 decades swinging a hammer in construction, riding a bike. Well, he also rode a lot of bikes, and he was a messenger, and he also poured drinks as a bartender. He never did any drinking himself, but he poured a lot of them. Now, Ron last joined us about 5 months ago to talk about this terrific book. If you love Baltimore, it will love you back. 171 short but true stories, friends. I guarantee, as they used to say in the old days, if you call Baltimore your hometown as I do, then you will love this book. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Ron Casey.
Cassie. Thanks, Bob. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the shout out and the shout out about the book. It was great visiting last time. I'm looking forward to it tonight.
Well, how's your pitching art, man? All right?
I haven't pitched in a while, but I was a pitcher in high school in American Legion ball. Yeah, growing up.
Yeah, I remember.
Left-hander.
I remember hitting you once. Yep, I knocked it out of the park. Well, tonight we're going to talk about baseball. When we reviewed your book last October, we touched on Roy Campanella and your respect for the Negro Leagues, and we'll return to that later on in this program, especially Roy Campanella, because Roy Campanella was the big person behind Leon Day. He was the person that always voted for Leon Day. And it was a terrible situation happened back there in, just before he got into the Hall of Fame, in which Leon Day was kept from getting into the Hall of Fame because Roy Campanella was sick and he could not vote. That was a terrible thing to do, and I raised holy hell with the not the New York Times, with the Hall of Fame, and they listened to me. They listened to me because I've been working with those guys up there in the Hall of Fame for quite a while on this particular project, and they understood that was a big mistake. So I'm glad they are going to correct that someday. Well, let's start talking about original Orioles in the International League Orioles and their great championship teams of the 1890s. Why do you call them the first great team in modern baseball?
Well, they were, and this was not the International League Orioles. This was actually the National League Orioles. This was the first great modern era or modern baseball team. They won 3 pennants in a row. I want to make sure I have my dates right. 95, 96, and 97, and they won back-to-back Temple Cups, which were the the World Series at the time, when the National League and the American League would play each other, and there were Hall of Famers, numerous Hall of Famers on those teams, including John McGraw and Wilbert Robinson and Wee Willie Keeler and Ned Hanlon, the manager. In fact, four of those Orioles are buried together up in the same cemetery in West Baltimore.
Well, the Hall of Famer John McGraw, the profane and pugnacious, as they used to say,
right.
Undeterrable, break all the rules third baseman.
Yeah.
That's baseball. Tell us about him and why you call him the backbone of the early Orioles.
Well, remember in the 1890s, life is a little bit different than it was today.
Oh, really?
And, right, and these guys were almost all first generation immigrants, right? They were the children of Irish railroad workers. Almost exclusively, that early Baltimore team was made up of the sons of Irish immigrants who probably were not looking forward to a life in the coal mines or laying railroad track their whole life, and their way out, a long shot then as is today, was playing ball, and this is John McGraw. He got cut from his first, he's not a guy of large stature, tremendous athletic skill, but he was a good fielder and learned how to hit, and was as competitive as the day is long, and he wouldn't go home, until he caught on with another club, and eventually made his way to Baltimore. But that whole team of Wee Willie Keeler, they all had these wonderfully colorful nicknames, like McGraw's was Muggsy, Dirty Jack Boyle, another Irishman, Duke Esper, Kid Gleason, Doc Pond, Sadie McMahon, Foxy Ned Hanlon, real colorful bunch that played with like the sharpened spikes of the day, and were known to get in fights with umpires, opposing players, opposing fans, each other from time to time. And this was a game. This is when baseball was, a more physical game, in the sense that it was a lot of hit and runs, a lot of stealing of bases, the Baltimore chop, the bunt. So much more kind of like hand-to-hand combat than we think of baseball today.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And hey, what is the Baltimore chop?
Well, the Baltimore chop is the practice of really packing the dirt down really hard in front of home plate. People who watched the game in the 70s and stuff with AstroTurf would understand this. And it's taking a pitch and intentionally hitting the top part of the ball and driving it into the hard compacted dirt or AstroTurf right in front of home plate, and getting the ball to bounce so high in the air that by the time the catcher or pitcher catches it, you're 3/4 down the way to first base and they can't throw you out. So that's the quintessential Baltimore chop. Much scrappier brand of baseball than the Orioles became famous for, with the 3-run homer under Earl Weaver.
Well, they were feisty Orioles, all right. You say they invented small ball, the sacrifice bunt, the hit and run, the double steal, and you mentioned, of course, the Baltimore chop. You tell us a bit more about those other sacrifice bunts and hit and run. When we were in Little League, we tried to get those sacrifice bunts, but we never could. Were you ever a good bunter? Tell the truth. Were you ever a good bunter?
To be honest, I usually batted like I was not a good fielder, but I could hit. I usually batted like third or fourth, so I wasn't called upon to bunt.
Oh, whoa!
I was the guy who was supposed to drive in the runs, hopefully.
Very responsible, and you still are, right? Right?
Yeah, I would have been maybe a designated hitter or something like that. I wasn't very good in the field, but this is the baseball that real baseball fans really appreciate, right? Earl Weaver once said, and the Orioles actually did steal bases in his heyday in the 70s, but the time to play for one run is when you need one run, and this was the kind of baseball was. It was a dead ball era, right? So the ball is not as hard as it is today, right? And the bats were heavier to swing, and it was much harder to drive the ball because you're hitting more of a beanbag. And the balls were they didn't play with 100 balls during the game, all shiny and new. They played with a couple balls that were like beanbags by the end of the day, right? At the end of the afternoon, dirty, scuffed up, and you took a shorter swing at the ball. It was hard to hit. You Baltimore Chop, or you laid down a bunt. As Wee Willie Keeler famously, somebody asked him what his secret was, and he said, "Hit them where they ain't."
Right, of course.
And so that kind of going the opposite field with the ball and all that stuff we don't see much of today. With the 3-run homer was really exciting brand of baseball. When pitching and defense and it's called small ball was all at a premium. And this is why it was a livelier game in a sense. There's more collisions at the bases, double plays, breaking up, barreling into the catcher.
Just like Negro League baseball.
Baseball, all of it was this kind of like this, I guess I'd imagine, before the dead ball era, right? This is the dead ball era.
Right.
Yeah, the Negro Leagues, of course, produce a number of tremendous home run hitters themselves.
That's for sure.
Obviously, yeah.
Well, how many players from this team that we talked about went on to the Hall of Fame? And where are they buried? I think you mentioned they're buried all together. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's John McGraw, Joe Kelly, Ned Hanlon, and Wilbert Robinson are all buried at New Cathedral Cemetery. And, it's not far from Camden Yards. And there's baseball fans, really, serious historians of the game and stuff like that, who will go visit the cemetery where they're buried. Because we draw people to Camden Yards, baseball fans from out of town, of course, wanting to see the ballpark. Mm-hmm. And fans will make the trip to the Babe Ruth Museum. They'll make a trip to the cemetery, hardcore fans and stuff like that. So it's not a secret, but it's not really as well known as it should that these 4 great Hall of Famers all started here. In many ways, the birth of modern baseball. And so McGraw, who becomes the manager of the New York Giants, famously.
Giants.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, that Wilbert Robinson, who was the catcher and kind of a big gregarious sort of guy, he and McGraw owned a saloon on Howard Street. And they get credited for inventing duck pin bowling.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I was going to ask you that question.
At their saloon. I don't know if it's because the saloon was it was like a sports bar of the day, right? So you have darts, I guess, and billiards, and you have duck pin bowling. There was no video games to play at the bar in those days. But I don't know if it was partially for room they went with duck pins, the smaller ball, or it was maybe the little less wear and tear in the throwing arms, maybe. I don't know. But that's a great, it's one. Babe Ruth famously played duck pins when he was, in Baltimore.
Well, as a matter of fact, that's the next person we're going to discuss right now at this very minute. Oh, but we got to take a break. Time out here on the playing field on 21st Century Radio and with our guest, Ron Cassie. Cassie, is that correct?
Cassie, yes.
Yes, all right. I'll blame that on somebody else over there. He's the senior editor of Baltimore Magazine, and he sits up straight. So, on with the news.
This is Julia Ruth Stevens, reminding you to stay tuned to 21st Century Radio's Hieronimus and Company to hear more about my dad, Babe Ruth.
Ruth got a homer, Ruth got a homer, they got a homer from Ruth today for sure. George, you can do it, we always knew it. Here come the Bostons, they'll win today for sure.
Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. And Ron Cassie is our guest, and right now we want to talk about Babe Ruth, the most famous Baltimorean to play everyday baseball ever. He's my hero, Babe Ruth. We all know Babe Ruth's seemingly inhuman achievements in baseball, but I want to talk about Babe Ruth, the humanitarian. That's who you made come to life in your article, A Man for All Seasons, by the way. The photo colorizing of John Tennant was worth it alone. Congratulations on that. Really. Oh, I just had such a good time. So you can click on that article. Did you say your grandfather saw Babe Ruth play when he was a kid?
I did. My grandfather was born in 1911. And so when he was a kid, his name was Frank, and his cousin Frankie, the two of them were pin setters in a bowling alley and would save their nickels. Now, this is the early mid-20s and later 20s when Babe Ruth is playing in New York. They would save their nickels and go to double headers to see Ruth and Garrick and Tony Lazzari and Bob Musial and all the great Bill Dickey, all the great Yankees of the day. Yeah. And my grandfather lived to be 94, an enormous baseball fan. I took him to see the Orioles and Yankees play at Camden Yards. He was thrilled.
Well, you start out your article with a vivid description of Babe Ruth's first return to Baltimore as a professional baseball player. As a 19-year-old with the Red Sox, you talk about my old neighborhood and how lucky the kids were who lived in those row homes along Greenmount Avenue. I lived on 2930 Greenmount Avenue, and we got a lot of balls knocked up on our on the roofs. As a matter of fact, my father-in-law at that particular time, my stepfather actually, he actually sold tickets for the roof. to watch the games for the roof until everything burned down and that kind of thing. Well, so I'm very favorable towards 2930 Greenmount Avenue and the Legends, where when Babe Ruth played on old Oriole Ballpark and hit the ball out of the park. Will you talk to us a little bit about this?
I will, and it's really a scene when I went back and read the archives and the accounts in the Baltimore newspapers. It's really a scene out of the movie The Natural. And I was lucky. I'll say this as a kid in Allentown, Pennsylvania, during a break in the schedule one time. Mike Schmidt and Greg Lazinski with the Phillies came up to Bicentennial Park, our cozy minor league park in Allentown, built in a row house neighborhood, whereas left field had a tall fence, and behind it was a street and then a bunch of row houses. And those two started hitting balls into the lights and into the backyards, and kids were scrambling around in the streets and everything. This is what it reminded me of. Ruth has just had put forth the greatest, at 19 years old, left-hander, the greatest pitching performance at that time ever in the World Series, pitching the Red Sox to their third title in 4 years. He's becoming an enormous celebrity in the game as a left-handed pitcher. And but he also hit 11 home runs in between his pitching, prowess the season before. I mean, he was the best left-handed pitcher in baseball at this time. And he comes back to Baltimore after spring training. So the Red Sox are coming up north, right? And they're playing barnstorming kind of exhibition games. And he comes to Baltimore, and for 2 straight days, the Red Sox are playing the International League Orioles, Ruth's first club, which is really great baseball in those days. And Babe Ruth hit 6 home runs and 6 at bats at one point, just unheard of in the era. Balls that were hit so far, the reporter said that second base, the outfield wall appeared to be where second base was. That's how far he cleared it, and he was hitting over telegraph wires and onto the rooftops of row houses, and there was stories recount of kids chasing the balls, and he had hit 11 home runs the previous season, which was the most in the major league that year, playing just barely part-time. And really, so he's really, that moment in Baltimore, April 18th, 1919, when he hit 6 home runs and 6 straight at-bats, 3 of which traveled more than 500 feet. Mm-hmm. The course of the game has kind of changed in baseball history, right there in that moment. It presages this momentous year he's about to have in 1920 when he hits 29 home runs, mm-hmm. Which is more than nearly every other team in the league. And he's on his way to becoming such a superstar that, of course, as we know, the Red Sox end up shipping him to New York. The owner for cash to invest in a Broadway play.
What did they get? 100,000? Was that?
Yeah, I mean it's a lot of money in those days. It's obviously yeah. So Babe Ruth is still pitching in 1919. He goes 9-5 in 15 starts. It was a great 2.97 ERA, but he hits 29 home runs, which is like more than almost every other club single-handedly.
Yeah.
And he's becomes the biggest superstar in the game, and he's also this incredibly colorful, should we say, personality.
Well, as you say, he was our first rock star, and he sure was. Boy, he toppled record after record. He literally changed baseball, just as you said, and he also saved baseball. We can go on about his godlike achievements, but it's his broader legacy as a humanitarian that really interests me. Give us some examples of what he routinely did at the height of his celebrity.
Yeah, I want to say this, and what you get on right now is exactly why I wanted to really write this story. That Donald Trump awarded Babe Ruth the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which irked me to no end that Trump would claim him, because if Babe Ruth is the anti-Donald Trump.
That's exactly right. Yes.
And Babe Ruth never met a stranger in his life. He was never forgot where he came from, never forgot a day of his life, never failed an interview. He grew up in essentially a home for wayward boys / orphanage. The idea that somebody would be generous to a fault, Ruth would have no idea what somebody would mean by that statement. He took the New York Yankees into Sing Sing to play against a prison team. He did a barnstorming trip to Hawaii, and when he was informed that lepers were not allowed to come to the game, Babe Ruth went to the leper colony to meet with them. Mm-hmm. He went to what our former president would call S-hole countries, Mexico, the Philippines, Cuba, on barnstorming tours. He played in Japan, China. He basically got suspended from baseball because he would not stop playing in the off-season barnstorming tours with Negro League teams. Right. He was a huge advocate for black baseball players, for the Negro Leagues, imploring people in white newspapers to go see the black players play. He visited at a time when the country is enormously, obviously segregated. He would go to and visit black children's hospitals, and I think one of the great stories you hear is from the Negro League ball players themselves, in their own words, saying, everybody played the Major League team, the Negro League teams played each other in the off season to make money. That's why they did it, right? Right. And he said white players fell into three camps. There's guys who did it just for the money and despised black ball players. There's people who when white ball players who did it and were ambivalent essentially about black ball players and the experience of playing with Negro League teams. And then there's guys who enjoyed the experience immensely and made friends, and that was Babe Ruth and Dizzy Dean and some of the other guys. And there's one quote from Judy Johnson, who's a Hall of Famer from Snow Hill, Maryland, saying how much they enjoyed playing with Babe Ruth because he was a fun-loving character, and him adding, but we could never figure out how to get him out.
Yeah, well, as you note, he was the first person ever to invite a black man, an entertainer, Bill Bojangles Robinson, into the Yankee clubhouse. Boy, that must have really caused some excitement there. All the publicity he drew to himself, barnstorming together, integrated with black teams and the Latin American teams, may have cost him a shot at managing after his playing career, something he really wanted to do. Why was that blocked for him?
Well, the judge, the mountain, what was his, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, I guess his name, was a Southern judge and on the record with racist comments, had no intention of desegregating baseball. And Ruth was known to be a really a strong advocate for black baseball in the Negro leagues, and it was believed that he would push for that. Now, I don't know if Babe Ruth would have been a great baseball manager or not. The recklessness of his youth largely subsided by the time he got married a second time. So, and clearly nobody becomes that great in the game without being an intelligent, athlete and everything. I mean, but great ball players don't always make great managers. We know that, but, yeah, I mean, he really wanted to do it. His life was baseball, and I'm sure he under different circumstances, would have gotten a shot, if nothing else, with probably a mediocre club who wanted to draw more attendance.
Well, some suggested, including his daughter, that his barnstorm tours may have made the owners nervous, which is what you're talking about,
right?
And that he was made manager. If he was made manager, he would have broken the gentleman's agreement, some gentleman's agreement that kept blacks out of the majors. This is the kind of thing that really rankles me to no end, realizing because having known so many Negro League ball players and known how poor they were. I mean, Leon Day, who's now in the Hall of Fame, but Leon Day, when I first met him, he was eating dog food. Do you want? Did you hear me? I mean, that's how poor. That's how poor. But many of I owe a lot of not just Negro League ball players, but a lot of African Americans my life, because my life was almost taken twice by white men and saved by black men. It's extraordinary. Okay, well, Babe Ruth was one of the first Americans to publicly denounce Hitler and his policy of exterminating the Jewish people. Do you think our former president would have said anything bad about Hitler? He also was a supporter of women's sports. Can you tell us anything about that?
It's interesting. You go on and on, but I mean, Babe Ruth gets his nickname, the Bambino, from Italian immigrant fans who are buying the cheap seats at the Polo Grounds, which was an Italian neighborhood. It's not that, as somebody says in the story, it's not that Babe Ruth was colorblind. It just made no difference to him.
Right.
And, like you said, he was a big supporter of women's athletics. He's one of the first. He was one of the prominent German Americans to sign a letter to the New York Times. It became a full-page ad denouncing Hitler, and his signature would have carried more weight than anybody else's. In the early 1940s, any other German Americans, and it's given his really hard scrabble upbringing, right? Essentially taken from his parents and put into a reformatory or orphanage, a really austere place to grow up at 7 years old. Whether it was in his, I think a large part is just in his nature, but certainly the fathers there, the priest there, also taught a message of empathy and compassion and love for one another that Ruth, carried with him out into the world, every day.
But as you note, the biggest place in his heart was for children, especially sick, underprivileged children, probably because they reminded him of himself. He never stopped being grateful for those who saved him from a life in jail or an early death, especially the kind of things that go on today with the police. Tell us about some of his trips to orphanages and children's hospitals.
Well, he did it nonstop, throughout his whole life, and he did it before ball games, and he would obviously we don't think of Babe Ruth as somebody who missed a lot of meals, but he would skip a lunch. He would skip lunch, if there was a request to go to a children's hospital, an orphanage, he was a man of, enormous energy. We just have to say that as well. He was not somebody of physical energy who sat around reading books or watching television, of course, which didn't exist in those days. He was out in the world, and he made frequent trips. And there's the story that's kind of funny. Saturday Night Live did a skit with John Belushi about the boy in the hospital, Babe Ruth promising to hit a home run for him.
Yeah.
And Babe Ruth the truth is, he had 2 home runs that day. Johnny Sylvester and was the guy's name, and he lived. The little boy outlived Babe Ruth, who was supposed to be dying in the hospital. And the Babe Ruth Museum in Baltimore is just really worth a must visit for everybody, any baseball fan. And they have a copy of they have the ball that Babe Ruth signed from Johnny Sylvester there. And he visited Babe Ruth when his hero was dying of cancer.
Yeah, that was so touching.
Yeah,
oh, boy,
really touching. Yeah.
Whoa, wow.
I think there's there's a line about how people would come to these. There's no television or anything, or radio, but so when they're doing these barnstorming trips to Missouri and Kansas and Indiana and Illinois, all across, right, Arkansas, all across the South and Southwest and Midwest in the off season, people came from miles around by wagons, right, to see Babe Ruth. And one of his teammates says he saw people come through the open wagons through the prairies of Oklahoma to see exhibition games, and everybody just dying to get an autograph, get a recognition of hello, and they said hiya, Babe. And Wade Hoyt famously said he never let them down, not once. And he obviously got energized by these interactions as well with people. They gave him energy, which rather than exhausting like it would most of us. Babe Ruth was somebody who really got out a lot, but he never turned his back. I mean, his whole life long, and never tried to hide where he came from or his circumstances or anything. Never downplayed that. It was always told people about, as you said, the people who looked after him as a child, who saved his life, saved him from the jail or the early grave, and never lost sight, never and lost gratitude for that.
As you noted, he would always come back to visit St. Mary's when the Yankees played nearby. What did he do after the school was struck by a devastating fire? What did he do about that?
Well, that's another. I'll say that's another thing that got me really. I knew I had to say. I wanted to tell this story. I was up in Cooperstown just a couple of years ago. I was swinging back from a trip and had to go to Cooperstown, and I saw a photograph of Babe Ruth with like 50 kids from the St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys, and where he is St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys in nearby near Catonsville today. And the school had burned down. There had been a terrible fire. And Babe Ruth took the St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys marching band on tour with the Yankees on the road, paying their way for hotels and everything so they could perform before and after games for the big crowds and pass the hat to raise money to rebuild the school. It's unfathomable to imagine a superstar athlete in any sport paying the way for 50 kids in a school marching band to go on the road with them and play in ballparks, up and down the East Coast, mostly in those days, baseball teams, right? Washington Senators, Boston Red Sox, and pass the hat. Like I said, just I don't know how he convinced the Yankees to go along.
I was wondering that too. I mean, geez, whiz, they were they were as corporate as you could be.
Right. Right.
What are some of your favorite myths or legends that have grown up around the Babe?
Well, one of the things I like is the story of the called shot in the 1932 World Series. He's towards the end of his career, and it's one of the Yankees had been traded from the Yankees to the Chicago Cubs during the season, and the Cubs voted the former Yankee only a partial share of their World Series money. They had decided that, and Babe, of course, was generous beyond belief. called him out in the newspapers, a little trash talking in the media for calling the Cubs cheapskates.
Yeah.
And, so there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of hostility between the teams, a lot of catcalling, and Cubs, other teams famously would throw racially explicit names at Ruth.
Yep.
Because he would talk in the Chicago papers about the Chicago Defender called him a friend of the race. He would, suggest people go see the Negro League World Series, and so, they're calling him every name in the book, and he actually hit a home run like the first inning of the game, and then when the game's close again, he comes up later and famously kind of looks at 2 strikes go by, and he's down in the count, and famously steps out of the box and points his bat towards center field, and basically indicating, I'm sending the next one out to center field. And he does. He hits one of the longest home runs ever in Wrigley Field, dead center, exactly where he pointed with the bat. And, I think there was some dispute about this for a long time, but there was more recent evidence, and it's on YouTube, and the Babe Ruth Museum has it, of evidence where you can see this. A home movie came to light of Ruth pointing his called shot, and one of the people on hand that day actually was Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens.
Oh.
And he always maintained that Ruth had done it, that he called the shot and it was done.
That's right.
And as did Lou Gehrig. The next day tells a reporter, what do you think of the nerve of that big monkey calling his shot and getting away with it? And you can see Ruth in the image, in the video, smiling as he's coming around the bases and pointing at the Chicago Cubs dugout. And so it's all these things coming together. Him being super competitive, the talent, the competitive fire, the trash talking, all that stuff, and then kind of laughing at himself for being foolish enough to even.
So I agree. I agree
yeah.
with you that he was the best-hearted fellow who ever lived. Never heard anybody who didn't like Babe Ruth. But we got to move on now to.
Okay.
Oh, but first we got to take a break. Time out on the playing field. We'll be right back and talk about Negro Leagues and Roy Campanella with Ron Cassie. And please check out his writings, that is Cassie's writings, on the BaltimoreMagazine.com.
This is Hall of Famer Monty Irvin, reminding you to stay tuned to 21st Century Radio's Hieronimus and Company for updates on Negro League baseball stars.
Wow, there was Monty Irvin. Monty Irvin was so close to Leon Day. As a matter of fact, he was the main man behind him, and with his help, we were able to get him into the Hall of Fame. It really made a very big difference, indeed. Well, you have written about Negro Leagues in Baltimore, and I agree with you that the city needs to put up statues, historical markers to remember Baltimore's rich Negro League history, the players and their former ballparks. Baltimore was the setting for the Negro League World Series in 1920, 1924, and 1926. Would you like to talk to us about that?
Baltimore has a fantastic, legacy. Really, have two teams: the earlier Baltimore Black Sox and the Baltimore Elite Giants. Some of the greatest. Satchel Paige pitched briefly for the Black Sox. The Black Sox had the kind of famous $1 million infield. Leon Day grew up in Baltimore, going to see Black Sox games, and obviously, as you mentioned, grew up to be a Hall of Fame pitcher himself. What I wrote about a little bit with Roy Campanella is, these great Dodger teams of the 1950s. Everybody knows the story of Jackie Robinson, but three players: Roy Campanella, a three-time MVP in the National League, pitcher Joe Black, and Junior Gilliam. In fact, Joe Black and Junior Gilliam were in like back-to-back Rookie of the Year honors in 52 and 53. Yeah. All three of those guys played in Baltimore, the Elite Giants, and specifically Roy Campanella. I believe he played 8 or 9 years in the Negro Leagues before he finally got a shot.
That's right.
He was like 26 years old. He's somebody physically and talent-wise was clearly ready for the major leagues at like 19 years old. He was a fully formed major league ball player and athlete at that point. And the only reason he came in a year after Jackie Robinson was not ability. They played together in Montreal. Was Branch Rickey made the decision that Jackie Robinson was the right guy to break the color line, and they thought one player was the way to do it, not multiple players. After that, Roy Campanella and others kind of quickly followed. But Roy Campanella was, in reality, probably a better baseball player than Jackie Robinson. Even though Jackie Robinson was probably certainly the greater athlete, right? He started at UCLA and basketball and football, and his brother ran the Olympics. But Roy Campanella was, may have been just the greatest baseball catcher who ever lived.
Well, I agree with you along those lines, especially in regards to the way Campanella looked out for Leon Day, which I've already mentioned, so I can't go back on that. But it was really important, unfortunately, when Campanella couldn't put that vote in 1993. He was not allowed to vote because he was sick. That's what changed Leon Day's life in a negative way, because he had been waiting for it. He knew that he had the votes to do it, but it was the Hall of Fame that said, no, you can't allow that to happen. That's when we went pretty crazy, as a matter of fact, and we were very fortunate to be able to talk directly to the top people there, so that they changed their mind, even to the point where they were not going to allow Geraldine Day to have the Hall of Fame ring. They felt that a woman should not have a Hall of Fame ring, especially, and so fortunately, we talked them into it, and they agreed finally that she deserved the ring. These kind of struggles are still ongoing. Back here in Baltimore, we had some individuals that were actually Orioles. What'd you call? What'd you say, Lars? Commentators? Yeah, of course. That basically came down on Leon Day like you can't believe. They said to me and others, Leon Day will never get into the Hall of Fame. He doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame. And all this Negro League player stuff is a bunch of crap. These were guys that we were listening to just 20-some years ago in Baltimore. And I, fortunately, I have a very good friend, Gary Sieradkowski. And Gary and I were knocking on the door all the time of all these other different teams. And he was there when he heard this man say to me, when I said, hey, I've got 6 books I can give you right now to prove my point. I would give you to him. You don't have to pay for them. And he said, I don't want them. They're not true. Negro League baseball, as far as he was concerned, the ballparks were too small. That's a lie. That the equipment that they had was inferior, which is true, because they used the baseball until it fell apart. But that didn't mean that they were not hitting that ball out of the field, especially over 500 feet, like the time in Washington, D.C., et cetera, et cetera. So, as you can tell, I feel very strongly about this, because Leon Day almost did not make it. And
he's from an era too. He was drafted in the middle of his career in World War II, and was a part of the the D-Day invasion, right, on Utah Beach. Right, he had in many ways just a remarkable human being, a remarkable story, as much as anybody's, and was a huge star for the Newark Eagles. I mean, he played for the Black Sox first, right, and then the LA Giants at the end of his career. But he had been a big star for the really powerful Newark Eagles teams.
Yes, he did. Well, unfortunately, we're coming upon our final break of this hour. We can return to some Negro League baseball when we get back here. I'm sorry I've taken so much time in talking about this, but obviously this is something my whole family lived with when I worked on this with a group of people to get him into the Hall of Fame. We succeeded, but it was far from easy. We'll be back with Ron Cassie, senior editor of Baltimore Magazine, and we'll be talking more about, eventually going to get to Jim Palmer, I hope, and check out some of the other writings at BaltimoreMagazine.com.
He's waiting for you.